Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma and I have with me Raji Rajagopalan, and we are going to discuss the INF, the official death of the INF Treaty and how is it going to affect the world. What did it mean when the INF Treaty was in place? But when President Trump decided to withdraw from the INF Treaty and gave 6 months time for Russia to fall in line, but then now that it has officially died on the 2nd of August, Raji, how do you think this is going to affect the rest of the world? And when the INF Treaty was in place, what was the INF Treaty? How did it keep everything under check?
So INF Treaty, obviously now it's come to an end, and that entire process because President Trump, he gave a warning, 6-month warning, and then walked out of the treaty. But I think there is more to it than just simply saying that it was Trump's own way of, this was Trump's tantrums and so on and so forth. I think there's much more to it. First and foremost, I think even President Obama, when he was in office, he talked about the Russian breaches, for instance. There have been instances where Russia was seen as developing certain kind of missiles that fall under the INF Treaty bracket in a sense. And that was one of the reasons, and there have been repeated statements from the US side asking the Russians to comply with it so that you don't have to walk out of it. But first and foremost, I think the point to look at is that this is of course a bilateral treaty agreement between the US and Russia, but it has had a much larger impact in keeping the some semblance of stability and in this much larger part of the world, whether you're looking at Europe and even in Asia, it has had an impact because it had stopped or it had prohibited an entire class of weapons from being deployed anywhere in the world. The entire range of short and intermediate range missiles, so anywhere between 500 to 5,500 kilometer range was prohibited. So there was no deployment of this class of weapons by both the US and the Soviet Union. It had its own impact in terms of stabilizing Europe, because this was the height of the Cold War under that context that the treaty came about. So it had a huge impact in terms of stabilizing the European region. The NATO context
Like you said, even President Obama was worried about it, but with Trump being in power, he took that decision, and he's known for taking such unilateral decisions. But he said that Moscow has been cheating for years on the 1987 pact between Russia and the US, and America cannot be seen as the only country which is adhering to this. After that, now that the treaty had died, the August 18 test of an American missile, which was previously banned by the INF Treaty, and the response that we saw from China and Russia, does it give rise to the fear that we are now headlong into a new era?
So first one, I think I want to say that this is not just about Trump. Trump is known to walk out of treaties and international agreements, but this is not about Trump. The repeated attempts by Obama administration to Russia to play by the rules of the INF Treaty was very clear, and so this is not just
Russia was not playing by the rules.
Was not. For instance, the Russians had developed a particular missile called the 9M729, which was in a sense breaking the rules. Even though the Russians have come out denying that they have developed or going to be deploying that particular class of missile, saying that it was still within the range, that it is about 480 kilometers. So it was within the 500 kilometer range, so it was not crossing. But the reality is that there has been, back in early 2000 when Putin was in office, he talked about getting out of the INF Treaty, saying that this is a relic of the Cold War, why are we sticking around? So the tendency on the part of the Russians also to walk out of the treaty was as early as 2000, you could see that. So in a sense, this was kind of something that has been building up both on the Russian side, and the Russians have their own concerns about other countries as well.
So I wanted to ask that what was the Russian concern? Why was Russia so keen to walk out of this treaty?
So of course, one of the things is that there has been slow deterioration of the US-Russia relations that's been happening. But also the other aspect, other relationship that could have impacted is, of course, the China factor. Even though that they are the best of friends, at least apparently today, there are growing concerns about the Chinese military power and the strategic impact, strategic consequences of the China rise factor, and how that might impact upon Russia's own security in the future. So I think that because the Chinese are developing an entire range of missile capabilities, their inventory is close to about 2,000 missiles in that particular bracket, and at least about 95% of that in 2000 missile categories are outside of the INF range. If they were party to that INF like treaty mechanism, they would have been actually not compliant with the rules of the treaty mechanism. So I think there are bigger problems including for Russia. They do look at China as an important factor, and I think that also could have played into the hands of the Russian calculations when they say that, you know, why we're sticking to this particular treaty, should we look at something more global, so that it encompasses other countries also into the grouping, into a future mechanisms and so on and so forth.
Yeah, like you said that Putin's reckless deployment of that 9 M729 cruise missile in violation of the agreement, that was kind of a trigger for something like this. Now this is regrettable that the INF Treaty is not in place. Now that it is not in place, this is a big concern for Europe and Asia, especially Europe too, because in the 80s there were these kind of threats and the INF Treaty came in place. So what kind of concerns now for Europe and Asia with this treaty not being in place?
Of course, I think there are concerns in Europe as well, especially if you are going to be placing missile defense interceptors in various countries in the European context. I think that's going to be. But I think the theater of possible conflict, this is the Asia is the 21st century, where the action is going to be, so to say, because you have the rising powers in this part of the world, and therefore there are greater concerns about what might happen, what are the kind of implications of some of the technology developments, including missiles and so on and so forth. And Asia is also one of the largest military spending regions in a sense, in terms of the military spending, the expenditure, pure expenditure, but also the kind of military power that this region is developing at a faster pace. I think that's also kind of part of the problem. The one specific concern that has been raised in the last few months, and by a lot of the government folks as well as those in the academia, think tank, policy world, is that now that the US is not bound by the INF Treaty, would the US deploy more missiles in the Asia Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific as we call it now? I think that's a genuine concern for a lot of countries, including for Russia, including for China. And the question that you asked, this is going to be what are the reactions going to be from some of these countries, including India. We have concerns about, but I think the part of the calculations from the American side, from Trump's side, is that they wanted to bring China into the sort of an INF kind of a mechanism.
Absolutely. Yes.
That has been, so while Russia made some treaty breaches and so on and so forth, I think the main reason, the main logic or the rationale for Trump to walk out of the INF Treaty was the China factor.
To bring in China, right? Because China was not part of the treaty.
So because this is a bilateral mechanism between, because that was developed in a different context in a sense, and therefore at that point of time China was not the biggest concern.
I see, and now China is a very big concern. So China not being part of any treaty does not serve the purpose.
Absolutely.
Actually.
But at the same time, is that going to be a realistic goal to bring China into any sort of mechanism? Or for that matter, I think most countries are developing or do already have a sizable missile inventory of short and medium range missiles, because that's what we need, whether it is India-Pakistan context, India-China requirement. China's own requirements are in this regard. Japan doesn't have a sizable. South Korea, the Korean Peninsula situation, and therefore South Koreans are developing certain capabilities. So each of our major powers, when you look at it, they all have a sizable short and INF range missile capabilities already exist there. And that is because there are genuine security concerns, and therefore they have developed these capabilities. Will they give up this in the hope that everybody is going to be nice and goody-goody and so on and so forth?
Do you think that bringing in China is not really an achievable goal, because
I don't think
it's going to limit China's
exactly. It is going to limit China's capabilities. It is going to, but also I think, for instance, the US, of course, they could use the longer range missiles if China is a problem. But I think the US also had concerns about their own local regional bases, military bases in the region, in the Asia Pacific, their own allies' concerns. That is also another concern that had driven Trump to do what he did finally. So I think those are the kind of limitations that it places on the US, and that is the reason why US wanted to be out of the INF Treaty, so that their hands are not tied, because you have the Russians' so-called breaches on the one hand. The Chinese are unimpeded. They are continuing with whatever they want to do.
Their own way to becoming a modern strategic nuclear
so
force.
If that is the case, why should the US have its own hands tied and be not developing certain capabilities?
How do you see this Chinese thread with their Dongfeng 41 and their Hong 6?
Absolutely, No, Chinese have been developing sophisticated capabilities from an Indian perspective. When you look at it, the DF-31s are becoming much more problematic because they can also launch it there, because most of them are on mobile platforms, and they can also they have a number of missile bases in near Tibet, in Delinga, one of the bases in Tibet. So they have it all around the Sino-Indian border area. So for India, these are very significant concerns. They are also developing slightly longer range DF-41. So the concerns from China, I think
that will be inducted eventually.
Exactly, absolutely, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So even from DF-31, because they are on mobile platform, they can also launch it. Even if they launch from somewhere, they can hit the southern sort of Tamil Nadu or Kerala, anywhere they want to do, they can. They are in a position to target some of those assets in these southern part of the Indian. So I think there is the China's growing missile capabilities, their size of the inventory is a serious problem. And I think this has been something that India has been raising with a lot of the Americans to say that, okay, fine, it's great that you have a missile arrangement, sort of a limitation arrangement with the Russians, but at what stage, when can you bring China on board and have some sort of restraining impact on the Chinese capabilities? But I think given the state of the great power relations today, I think it looks even more bleak. Difficult. Exactly, ever more challenging than before. Today you cannot get the major powers to agree on any issue. Forget about it's not specific to nuclear or space, but on any important global security issue, today you can't get all the major powers to sort of agree upon a course of action or future ways to deal with.
What is the development in terms of having a new treaty, a new pact between these countries that the talks have been on? Or
so there are, for instance, the countries like Japan are also going to be impacted seriously with the longer range missile capabilities that the Chinese would develop and so on and so forth. Therefore, as soon as the US walked out and the treaty was coming to an end, the Japanese had pushed for a global mechanism where you bring in all the major powers into that agreement. Or at the very least, the Japanese had suggested a trilateral arrangement between US, Russia and China. On both these counts, the Chinese have said there is just no way that they will agree to such an arrangement, a trilateral or even a broader one. Like I said, there are important political and security calculations behind the reason, behind the logic of this having short and medium range missiles by major countries, whether it is Iran, whether it is Pakistan, India, China, or the Koreans. So because their primary logic is to have those short and medium range. They don't really need those longer range missiles. So why would they give up and create more vulnerabilities for them for their security? So I think it's very unlikely that you will have a proper treaty-like mechanism. But I think that's where. But at the same time, given the intensity of the competition that is picking up, security competition picking up in this region, we need to move beyond and see at least can you work around building certain transparency and confidence building measures among states. Because you're not going to have a legal arrangement, a legal agreement, treaty-like mechanism, not going to happen. So at least can you have some sort of political agreements, a technical agreement, so that you are developing certain measures that would build greater confidence in each other, that would remove some of the vulnerabilities for states, because you don't know what the objective for developing a particular missile. So you can have smaller limited technical agreements between states, so that it eases some of the tensions in the region. That's the only way around I do see in the immediate time frame, because given the state of relations, whether it is you have Russia and China on the one side on most issues, and the US-led Western grouping on the other side. The meeting point between these two groupings is extremely difficult to materialize, and therefore we need to think about sort of very pragmatic transparency measures, confidence building measures, CBMs are possible way to go about in the current times.
Okay, so with the official death of the INF Treaty on the 2nd of August and what happened after that, there are the situations that could happen. One is that it could spark a new arm race, while, as you pointed out, it was imperative that there should be a reworking, because just the treaty between America and Russia will not solve the purpose. China has to be part of it. But right now it may also lead to, there is a prospect of an open-ended arm race the missile deployment. So that's a possibility too.
That is a possibility. In fact, many of the US senators who were convinced that they had to walk out of the treaty, but also very, very clear that, you know, walking out of a treaty without a follow-on mechanism is a recipe, perfect recipe for an arms race, because everybody is concerned. There is growing insecurities about each other. The Chinese, for instance, would say that, okay, the US is now no more bound by the INF Treaty limitations, so now they would go on to deploy their missile systems, missiles in Asia. But at the same time, I must also add that the Japanese have said that they will not allow for the US missile deployments in their territory first. That's part of the more of the alliance politics that is playing out. But at the same time, the reality is that many countries are not welcoming the US to deploy more missiles in Asia, because it would be seen as giving way to more tensions and competition and so on and so forth. Because if the US comes to deploy more missiles in Asia, that would become a legitimate justification for the Chinese to develop even further, and that could only kind of that could have a spiraling,
that could be a domino effect,
absolutely a spiraling effect in terms of India wanting to respond to China's developments, and then Pakistan following the suit and so on and so forth. So it is part of a larger, you know, there is a slow budding arms race that you are already seeing, and many countries will use the US as a cover to say that, you know, the US has done this, and that's why we are now forced to respond to some of these developments, irrespective of the US walking out of the treaty or not. I think there were many developments already in play, but it provides a nice cover for these countries, many countries, to say that, you know, we are forced to defend our own security, and therefore these are part of the security requirements that we are forced to develop now.
So like you said, that looking at the current political equation between the countries, any kind of formal treaty looks unlikely, but what is needed is more transparency and confidence building measures.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for explaining that to us.
Thank
Raji.
you.
Thank you.